Here's a picture of the club we're going to look at today, part of a very small, unique Native American weapon-making tradition. I mean tiny in the grand scheme of things, which just makes it that much more interesting. This is a Penobscot root club. And notice here how different it is from the previous example I've shown on this channel. See the face there? I really, really like that. But I like today's as well, and today's is a more typical example of the form. Here's a very brief quotation that touches on their transformation over time. These, quote, started as weapons, then became ceremonial tools as spirit clubs, then became tourist pieces, end quote. And basically, the more visually elaborate they are, the more touristy they are. So this one here is kind of in the middle, like it has a primitive look to it, but I do not mean that in the negative sense at all. Not tourist market looking, but it still could have been for that purpose. Meanwhile, this is from Antiques Roadshow, and this was clearly made for the sole purpose of selling. And I talked in my first video on this subject about how, it's good and bad. These weren't going to be made for war anymore. Only a certain number were going to be made for true ceremonial purposes. So the tourist trade does keep the craft alive, but it can also change it, as you can see here. This is a very cool example, but not my preference, and I wish tourists wanted to buy visually authentic ones. Traditional looking ones instead of forcing the makers to get into almost kitsch, like here. Anyway, Penobscot root clubs are part of the Northeastern Native American root club family, showing some video examples here, mine. But obviously the Penobscot Nation had their own take on it. It's not just the carving on the striking end, because that's not always present, as you can see here in this example, but the fact that they're almost always putting a face of some kind on there. That in conjunction with the almost ubiquitous spikes. So look at this example here. It's not an early one, but it looks more usable, right? In a fighting context, those points aren't razor sharp or anything, but they're not going to feel good. So the Penobscot within the United States were centered in Maine, but they also covered Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Quebec. But back to Maine, they were forced onto a reservation very early on, unfortunately, like starting around 1800, they were already being relegated to places like this. Here's an old postcard showing, quote-unquote, Indian Island. So it was an island on the Penobscot River. And if you go back to our map, it's very close to Bangor, Maine, which makes me think of Stephen King, so I wonder if he's ever visited here. Penobscot, by the way, is a corruption of the actual name that the people called themselves. I'm going to butcher it, I'm sure, but I'll give it a try. Penobscot, at least according to one of the two different spellings I found for it. So regardless of what the original indigenous term was, you could see how it would get corrupted by the settlers in translation. And these people and their warriors were tied to early colonial history, as you can imagine, because they happened to be on the East Coast, where they saw action in the French and Indian War and in the American Revolution. They sent hundreds of warriors in response to a written request from George Washington, and they served as scouts and fighters in his army in several campaigns, including in Quebec, 1775. The Indian Island Reservation we talked about was actually a quote-unquote reward for their services. But let's get back to our item here. It's about 2 feet long, made somewhere around 1910. And I've said this before, but I love the almost like dragon skin / claws look to the head. Typical floral carvings on the haft. A lot of effort goes into making these. I'll get into the actual process next time because I have another one to show you, and if I do that now, I won't have anything to say. As you know, on this channel, I do like to include some education along with just ogling these awesome old items. But I will say, and I know some of you already know this, root clubs are called that one because obviously they're made from the roots of trees, but it's the large, knotty, dense root that gives the club its striking portion. So when we're at the bottom of a weapon like this, we're at the bottom of the tree root as well, working our way up towards the actual tree. While we look at some of the decorative flourishes here, thinking about the actual head, they usually, if not always, have a face, and it can be human or non-human. As you saw in the snapshot from my previous video on this subject, the non-human could also appear to be more spirit than natural. For instance, here's one that we're told shows a Wendigo face. Of course, that was a creature, supernatural creature in the Native American cosmology, and I wonder if maybe that's the creature that's supposed to be portrayed on that demonic-looking face from the example I showed earlier in the video. Now, if I was going to own an authentic antique Penobscot Root Club, which I would love to do, my preference would be for the non-human face. Those are really cool. And with my interest in folklore and mythology, that should hardly be surprising. Here's again that great kind of scaly, I don't know, dinosaur dragon skin look. I guess the makers appreciated that as well because they could have carved that out, smoothed it out and whatnot, chip carved it, but luckily they didn't. One final look at the very stoic face on today's example of a very unique weapon-making tradition, like I said. At one time they were weapons, at one time they were talismans, I'm sure at one time they were both, and at one time later they were souvenirs. Thanks, bye.